Very nice to meet you.
All right.
Yeah, how are you doing? Good. Yeah, so maybe I'll just do a brief little introduction. I think Dr. Obbard probably doesn't need much introduction from many in this room, but he, as you may know, worked for most of his career at the Ministry of Natural Resources. Back when it was M&R, perhaps Lands and Forests back then.
Not quite.
Beer's not quite that way. So I erred on that. Before they added the forestry part at the other end, and is really a scientist emeritus with M&R, and also an adjunct professor at Trent University in Peterborough. And he holds a PhD from University of Guelph, a place that we all know and love from a biology perspective. And his research, of course, talking about black bears on the peninsula tonight, but equally or perhaps even more so working on polar bears in the western Hudson Bay lowlands, and particularly looking at the effects of climate change. And there was a Globe and Mail article on the weekend, on Saturday, which talked about some of the latest research and a census that have been done and the results of that. So we may hear a little bit about that tonight. So maybe without any further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Martyn Obbard.
Okay, so can we hear me? I feel like my daughter should be here helping do this thing. I feel like Britney Spears, you know what that is? My daughter told me this year. So anyway, hi everybody, and thanks to the group and to Parks Canada for the invitation. I haven't actually been up on the Bruce in 10 years, I can't believe, since a couple of years after the study ended. So tonight I was asked to talk about, what have I done here? The study that we had on the Bruce Peninsula. And I'll just mention this bear that's in this picture was one of our radio-collared yearlings that one of my summer students took a picture of back in 2010, I think. The family groups all had, the females had names, and then all the offspring had names in the same letter. So this is Wyatt, I think, who's down here. Anyway, can we talk about the study that we had on the Bruce? And so a little bit about the background about why the study started. So as early as 96 and 1997, I was contacted by our M&R staff at the time, and both in the district and the region, and also by Parks Canada staff. Trevor Keller from our M&R, and I shouldn't be Trevor Robinson, it should be Kevin Robinson, and Darlene Upton, who were with the park at the time. And I was actually conducting a study up in north of Chapleau in the Boreal Forest. And they contacted me because they were concerned about a number of issues. One was the possible isolation of this population of bears on the Bruce Peninsula, given the development that there had been over the several decades around the southern end of Georgian Bay. And the question was, were these bears on the Bruce Peninsula somehow isolated from bears in the rest of the province? Questions about a possible small population size of bears, would that be an issue, a conservation concern? Questions about habitat fragmentation, agriculture and ongoing development and what have you. And also that there were concerns about human-bear conflict. So all of these were issues that both our M&R and Parks Canada staff brought to the table when they approached me and asked whether I would be interested in working with both our regional and district staff and Parks Canada in starting another study. And at that point I was a little reluctant because I was up to my eyeballs. You may remember a fellow named Mike Harris. I hope to God you remember what he left us with when you vote tomorrow. Anyway, last political statement. Well, I saw a hell of a lot of blue signs on my way up here. Anyway, so at that, in 96, I lost all my support staff, so I've been trying to keep this study going in the Boreal Forest, and I said, I'm maxed out, I just don't have staff. But Parks Canada people said, well, we think that we can provide some of our input to the study would be staff time. And so we talked about it, we came back and forth. do something. So the question is, why would we want to study bears on the Bruce Peninsula? Well, there were in those days some important conservation concerns that I outlined, and we all know that we've got this pretty narrow peninsula here and tons of development down the bottom end, and apple orchards and ski hills and goodness knows what else, and could bears come from here and get back up under the Bruce or what was going on? So all those kinds of issues. And I don't need to, for this audience, I don't need to point this out, but it became really interesting ultimately in the study. The Niagara Escarpment comes up here, and we'll come to that later when we talk about denning. There's some pretty cool stuff that bears are doing on the Bruce Peninsula when they den on that Georgian Basin side. Okay, so why are bears here? Well, they're here because there are lots of natural areas that are good for bears. Some of the conservation concerns, of course, are habitat loss due to agriculture and habitat loss through development, urbanization, and fragmentation of habitat. Bears are pretty resilient, but ultimately, if habitat is fragmented too much, it becomes a real problem for them. And to a large extent, because they end up in human-bear conflict. They end up in your garbage can or trying to break into your whatever, your kitchen, your bird feeders, whatever. So here's some more of the background. So originally, we came up with a 3-year collaborative agreement between M&R Research and the Parks Canada Bruce Peninsula National Park, which was renewed several times, and we actually ran right through to the winter of 2006 with this study. And we had pretty good support from 2 managers at the time, Mike Briggs, who was in the park, and Chris Davies, who was my manager at the time. Turned out they were old pals, and they belonged to the same deer hunting camp. So, sometimes that's useful. Managers can be useful. Seen it very many times, but occasionally. So anyway, during 1997 and that winter of 97, 98, we had several conversations back and forth between the park folks and myself. And I had a young fellow working with me at the time named Alistair McKenzie, who is now actually the natural heritage lead at Pinery Provincial Park with M&R. Anyway, Al was a good, keen, young biologist, really good in the field. And I said, I can send Al down from my team in Chapleau to lead that study to start trapping bears in '98, which we did. And so on the ground, the co-leaders were Kevin Robinson and myself. And then obviously the management leads were Mike Brigg and Chris Davies. So Al started, Park Canada people should not take this personally, but I want to give one example of sort of miscommunication that can sometimes happen. So we were using a trap called a barrel trap, which was 2 1/3 45-gallon drums welded together end to end. And on this end that the bear would go in, there was a guillotine door. When the bear crawled into the trap, pulled on the trigger, the door would drop down. Well, you don't want those things. You want those things to kind of smell like a bear or whatever, so the bear's not reluctant to go in. Well, so Al came down with we sent down a couple of trailer loads of these traps in order to get started that summer trapping. And the Parks Canada ops people took one look at these rusty old traps that these M&R guys were using and decided they needed to be spray painted. So anyway, Tom will remember that. So anyway, all these traps got a fresh coat of paint, and of course the bears wouldn't go in them for children. But anyway, Al did manage to trap a few bears, and we got one adult female bear radio collar that fall. Anyway, so then you may remember that in 1999, the Harris government canceled the spring bear hunt, so my life was in totally chaos at that point. And so Parks Canada took the lead in for the next couple of years anyway, and the trapping effort, and largely led by Scott Sutton. So in 1999, we had a much larger effort, as you can see, and we had half a dozen females collared by the end of that season. so what were our various objectives? So we were interested in, because of this conservation concern, how many bears did we have on the Bruce Peninsula? Is this a potential issue of isolation a serious one? Is it a genetic concern? Then we were also interested in looking at dispersal patterns of young bears. Do young bears actually spill out of the Bruce and go elsewhere? Is there any chance that bears from the Bruce could reconnect, or bears could come into the Bruce, whatever? Oops, sorry. I have little issues here. All right, so PC led that summer capture work beginning in 1999, and my role, I wasn't able to be here in the summers, but my role was to bring graduate students on the project as appropriate. But we led, because Parks Canada staff had never done any of this, we led the winter handling and provided all the helicopter time related to that. So overall, it was a fairly small project. I didn't have a lot of money to put into it. Parks Canada didn't have a lot of money to put into it. But together, we could cobble together enough funds that we could have graduate students on the project and we could actually carry out the fieldwork. And a lot of it was Parks Canada staff time from their perspective. And so it was really important that we were sharing resources. I need to slow down here. There's a bit of a delay on this clicker. Okay, so here's a shot of one of our barrel traps, and here's, you can see this is the guillotine door, so the bear crawls in here, pulls on the trigger, and the door drops down, catches the bear. And from that, we could assess a whole bunch of things, including reproductive status and what have you. This is the outline of the trapping grid that we had set up in those days, where we were actually live trapping bears. You notice, I'm back up one here, sorry. You notice that we have what we call a 2-kilometer buffer around these traps. So in terms of spacing traps, we based this on information we had from the Boreal Forest Study, which is that the average radius of a female's home range is about 2.5 to 3 kilometers. So we felt that if we spaced them with this 2-kilometer buffing, that we were getting pretty good coverage of the available habitat, and we should have all bears in that area vulnerable to being caught in the trap. And this is another kind of trap on wheels that we could move in, borrow from the M&R. So all animals were ear tagged with these brightly colored plastic cattle tags. And we remove a tooth for aging. So a lot of carnivores, but especially bears, have a period in the winter where growth is really diminished. In fact, in bears, there's no growth over in the winter. And what you see, if you take a cross-section of the tooth, analogous to if you took a cross-section of a tree and counted the rings, but in that tooth they go kind of longitudinally. If you cut a longitudinal section in that tooth, you could actually count those lines and you can get an accurate age of the animal until it gets into maybe its late teens or 20s, and then it gets a bit pretty sketchy. So but anyway, this is not me, it's one of the Parks Canada people, but they're removing that little premolar, which is right in behind the canine. It's a vestigial bone, and we can use it for aging, get a pretty accurate age of the bears. This is my grad student who worked on this project as well, Melissa Cody. She's attaching a radio collar to this bear. And so Melissa especially, the Parks Canada staff and Melissa did a whole bunch of radio telemetry. Some of it was handheld, and monitored locations of the bears, would get movement patterns and home range size and what have you. And also a fair bit of aerial telemetry, which the Parks Canada people, Frank Burrows, in those days carried out. You get bears that move a fair bit. It's pretty hard to I mean, there's a fair road network on the peninsula, but there are lots of areas that are hard to get to, and where you could not get a signal from the ground, so that we would then use a small aircraft. So, right, and this is a couple of these slides are really old slides that the Parks Canada people gave me from presentations that people had given in the mid-2000s, but just to give you an idea of how the effort ramped up over this first few years. So you can see each one of these polygons is the home range of a particular adult female, and you can see Melissa and I used to argue about this. I said, Melissa, give them names, give them numbers. No, give them names. Anyway, so we had all these families do So Willow obviously would have had young that had W in their name and what have you. So anyway, this is, you see the colors and all the different home ranges. You can see we're almost all the way down the lines in here where we had females radio colored and could get a good indication of the habitat they were using and their movement patterns, et cetera, et cetera. So again, just to show you how it ramped up. I don't know if you probably know this. Larson, he loved bears. So a lot of his cartoons had bears. So you can just see in the early years how this ramped up in captures. So when it says mortalities here, that doesn't mean handling mortalities. We're not that crude. This means roadkills, right? So we had, in that very first year, we had 5 captures, radio colored, 1 adult female, and there were 4 roadkills from which we also were able to get genetic samples and then body size samples and what have you. Anyway, just to give you an idea of how it ramped up in those areas, we could get information on body size and what have you. And I don't know if you know this, but when black bear cubs are born, which is typically in January, they're pretty small. They're only about 300 grams, so they're no less than a pound. And interestingly, for you women in the audience, a bear cub when it's born is about 1/300th of the body mass of its mother. And if you had kids, your baby was probably 1/15th of the body mass, which is probably why it was hard to get at. So you might want to have worse than you were a bear. Anyway. All right, moving on. So we also had other things in trying to get genetic information. There had been a study done by Parks Canada people out in grizzly bear country where they're trying to monitor grizzly bears. Of course, they're really low density and it's pretty hard to have live traps out there. If you have life snares out, you might have a bear in there a while. There are all kinds of issues with potential limb damage and what have you. So a fellow named John Woods, a couple other people came up with this idea that if they had barbed wire strung around an attractant, and a bear was attracted, came in, went after the attractant, it would either step over the barbed wire or it would duck and go under the barbed wire. In either way, it might leave a tuft of hair behind. And with DNA technology of the mid-90s, we can get individual identification out of that, the DNA in that hair. So I saw them give a paper on this at a conference in 95. I thought, man, that's slick. So I started doing this in 97 up in Chapel, and then we used the same approach on the Bruce Peninsula study to get additional information on animals. And we also used that information to get an estimate of population size based on capture and recapture efforts and this individual DNA from all these bear samples, the hair samples rather. And here you can see a tuft of hair stuck on the bar. That's still ongoing this year, by the way, redoing it. I'll come back to that later. So here's where we had the hair trap locations, and we tried to get a similar distribution to where we had the live traps out in the early years of the study. So this was in 2001. And out of that, we ultimately developed an abundance estimate. So here's the abundance estimate we had from 2001. That was only within the park bounds. And analysis was done by a couple of people working for Parks Canada in those days. We had a total of 39 individuals detected. And when you do the recapture analysis, that it gets bumped up, and the estimate for the Upper Bruce, at least, essentially the park, was that there were 53 bears within the bounds of the park. And you can see a pretty tight confidence interval, actually. It ranged somewhere between 45 and 72. It was pretty tight. Anyway, that was early on. Okay, so what graduate students did we have involved in the project? Well, when I was talking to Kevin Robinson and then later Frank Burrows at the time, I said, we've got a small study. We need to have an approach that kind of makes sense. So to me, I think we need to have somebody look at population viability, have some estimates of the number of bears that are in the Bruce, and then how secure is that population. That was the first student that we had, a fellow named Eric Howe, who had been my summer student working on my boreal blackwood project. So he did what's called a population viability analysis. He made a number of assumptions about the area on the Bruce that was occupied, about the number of bears that were there, about the birth and death rates. And those were based on a study that had been done by my predecessor, actually, in the 70s, near North Bay. So a bit dated, but my data were from the boreal forest, so we didn't think that they were applicable. So Eric did that, and then he estimated the probability of extirpation of bears on the entire Bruce and then within the park itself, based on various management actions that an agency like M&R might take. So essentially, what he came up with was the most effective way to reduce extirpation risk of black bears. The first was absolutely important to conserve habitat outside of the national park. Second is to reduce incidental mortality. So bears that are killed in conflict with people, if they're at a, whatever, in somebody's dumpster or a restaurant or whatever they're doing. Anything that can be done to reduce incidental mortality. The third recommendation was that you could reduce overall harvest that's happening, and then the last recommendation was actually to reduce the proportion of adult females. I would have thought that reducing the proportion of adult females would have been higher ranked, but this is the way it worked out in Eric's modeling. So, he was partway through this, and we had the results from his population viability analysis suggesting that the most important thing we could do is to conserve habitat, but we didn't know what the habitat was that they were using. So it was time to get another student on the project. Can you help? Are you at the back there? Can you help advance that? So these are Eric. Thanks. These are Eric's results. So if the population was reduced to only the national park, then it had a very high probability of extirpation within 50 years, and that probability was approaching 1. So it was pretty much guaranteed. If we were reduced to the bears only in the national park, they'd be gone within 50 years, unless all forms of non-natural mortality were eliminated, and that seemed unlikely. But when he modeled what might happen to the entire peninsula, so north of Wyerton, there was still a greater than 50-50 chance that bears could be gone within 50 years if we had a harvest of more than 13 bears per year. And the probability of extirpation would be reduced if there was a strong male bias in the harvest. Now, typically there is a male bias in the harvest, because young males especially are they're dispersing, they're naive, they're more less risk averse than females, and so they're more likely to be harvested. And so that's possible. Anyway, so that was that. So then we got 2 more students on the project. One was Melissa Cody, who worked on the radio telemetry and the habitat stuff, and the other was a young woman named Karen Mills. And Karen was going to look at the genetic analysis. So we had DNA from all of the live trap bears. We had DNA also from our barbed wire hair traps. So she sampled all those profiles at a large number of microsatellite loci. She identified 70 individuals from the Bruce. And she had 70 samples, and she compared those to samples from elsewhere in Ontario. And what she came up with was that Bruce bears were genetically distinct from the rest of Ontario. And then the second last bullet here, that there was a suggestion that there were actually 2 groups on the Bruce that seemed to be genetically different. And this is really weird. Turns out that there may well have been some processing issues in the lab at the time. But anyway, that was what Karen had in 2005. Bears on the Bruce had a really low level of heterozygosity. That means that there was a high degree of inbreeding on the Bruce, and not much outbreeding, so not much evidence of bears coming in from elsewhere to the Bruce, and a low number of alleles at each locus than any other site in Ontario. So again, this red flag that, yeah, that concern that we had about genetic viability was probably warranted. So here are her results. So anyway, I won't go into how the actual analysis, but this is bears from the rest of Ontario, and here are the Bruce bears over here. So quite different. And then this weird suggestion that there were possibly 2 subgroups on the Bruce. So her supervisor at the time was a fellow named Brad White, who's now mostly retired from Trent. But Brad and I were co-supervising Karen. And Brad said, it looks to me it's really fascinating that we've got these two groups that are reproductively isolated. I said, Brad, that just doesn't make any sense. That can't be. Females are promiscuous. They'll mate with several males in one breeding season and so on, and males will mate with all kinds of females. We know that from other studies. This doesn't make sense. So we never published this because I was a little skeptical that there were some issues. The other thing is that we had this overlap. So we've got these two groups. So this yellow one's one group, blue is another, and you can see how they kind of overlap with each other. I said, it doesn't make any sense that females would only, mate with one of these, with males from their own group and so on. So we never ever published that, and I think subsequently we showed that it probably does not hold up. But anyway, that was the early days of 2005. Okay, so on to Melissa. So here's the title of Melissa's thesis, Distance-Based Analysis of Habitat Use. So she looked, we had intensive radio monitoring of all the animals that we had. We had visits to winter dens, so we had spring, summer, and fall habitat use. We had winter habitat use. And Melissa also did some really rigorous ground truthing of habitat information from satellite imagery. So within the whole Bruce Peninsula, we found that adult females tended to select dense mixed forests to establish their home range in the first place. Subadults and yearlings tended to select a little bit different stand, but dense deciduous forest stand. So that's, within the whole Bruce, if a female was going to establish her home range, that's the kind of habitat that she would look for. Within her home range, once she's got it established, there's going to be a mix, of course, of different habitat cluster or forest stands within the home range. Females tended to, again, choose this dense mixed forest in the spring and summer, dense deciduous in the fall. Subadults a little bit different. So you can see it's fairly complicated, and we published that paper. So a little bit different habitat selection between younger bears and older bears, especially females. We never had any adult males collared in this study. It's pretty hard to collar adult males, because their necks are really big. They're kind of like football players on steroids. It's like their neck starts at their shoulders and goes like this. And you put a collar on, it just slips up. Anyway, so probably females are more important anyway. Guys, sorry, it's true. And at least it'll go out. So at both scales then, this selection of dense deciduous and dense mixed forest stands really emphasizes the importance of protecting the integrity of those stands. So Eric, in his population viability analysis, had identified that it was really important to protect habitat outside of the park if we were going to have bears persist on the peninsula as a whole, but also within the park. And now Melissa has identified these are the forest stands that we really need to protect. And of course, these are the ones that are vulnerable to fragmentation. Right? People selling off lots and what have you. So this is the satellite imagery of the Bruce, and the dense conifers, they're really dark green. So you can see on the west side especially, with so many stands are essentially predominantly dense conifer. And then most of the other stuff, the dense deciduous and the dense mixed, tends to be on the east side of the peninsula. And those are the areas that are really important to the bears. Not that they're not found in coniferous areas, but they're going to be at lower density, and they're going to prefer to be in those other areas that are dense deciduous or dense mixed. So for winter denning, we visited, this is just the results from Melissa's thesis, so we actually had a couple more years data beyond Melissa's thesis, but we had 30 dens that we visited. 24 of those were within rock crevices, and I'll show you some pictures in a minute. So you know what the Bruce Peninsula is like, karst topography. There would be cracks in the limestone that would be, maybe only about that wide. So, and the bear was down there, often several meters down at the bottom of this crack in the rock, and in some kind of So they'd have to put a harness on me, and I was a little thinner in those days than I am now, but I would exhale as much as I could and wiggle down like this, and then get down to the bottom, and then then you had to figure out what was going on down there. It was obviously a bear. But and then when I had to come back up, they often had to just pull me on this harness because I couldn't get up. Anyway, pretty cool. And for me anyway, it was pretty exciting. So a lot of these, you get down in there, and there would be a chamber that looked for all the world as if a bear somehow had clawed out this chamber. It would be rounded on the surface of this, and the bear would be clawing. I said, well, of course, it wasn't the bear doing that. It was the melting of the glaciers and water action and so on. But pretty amazing to see some of these. So most of them were in these rock crevices. Several others where there were deeper saws, especially on the east side, were in excavated dens. A couple were under brush piles. And she's identified one here on their large boulder and a talus slope. We also had other bears on the Georgia Bay side in that talus slope. If you've ever seen it from the water, it's amazing to see. We had bears that were dead in there. We could never find them because the radio signal, fairly low frequency, would bounce so much with all the rock that we could never actually localize the bear. Pretty frustrating. We spent hours there sometimes trying to actually find out where the heck the bear was. So anyway, so yeah. Okay. And most of these bears were actually raking material in. And so I often have this image of a bear in the fall. It's got to gather bedding material that it's going to make a bed to lie on for the winter. And sometimes, not so much in this study, but in our boreal forest study, when we walked into bears a lot in the fall, so the female that had cubs of the year, she would be gathering up leaves, and you would see piles, so there'd be large piles of leaves where the adult female had been raking leaves up, and then I had this vision of them, picking them up, walking like this, dropping it down. But you'd also see little piles of leaves, so the little guys are learning actually. Anyway, so most of the bears on the Bruce also were lining their dens, and especially these ones down in the rock and whatever. And I'm sorry, this doesn't show very well, but this is a map Melissa had done. You can see where we had bears denning all the way down here in Lion's Head and up on the Georgia Bay, whatever. So they denned all over the place within their summer or fall home range somewhere. All right, so we had all these, and you can see how we ramped up the study in those early years. And again, Larson. These are a couple of the early bear researchers. Bob and Jim, no longer with us. So here we're going to show you a few pictures now of actually doing some of this winter work. So that's me on the left. You can see I aged gracefully. And that's Scott Sutton, right? We're actually looking at the map and figuring out where we ought to go. And a lot of this had to be helicopter access. A lot of them we could snowshoe into just from trucks or from the road, but quite a few of them were fairly remote and it would be a long hike. So and that's our crew from, I think, Tom, do you remember, was this 2005 or 6? Anyway, Tom Buckley here. Park, Scott, Frank Burrows, Jody Shifley from the MNR, a couple of people from the MNR, my grad student Melissa, our pilot, Doug Holtby, see more pictures of Doug in a second, and Derek Potter, who were still in our section working on bears. So here's your first look at the kind of crevice that these bears were down in. So you can see this is pretty narrow, straight down drop about between 2 and 3 meters, and the bear is down there somewhere. So this is not me. Any of you know a conservation officer named Wayne Lintuck used to be on the Bruce? So this is Wayne. So the bear, I drugged the bear, and I don't know exactly this story, whether it was just a female cub or what was going on, but Wayne was going down, the bears grew out, and Wayne's going to start trying to get the bear moved so that we can get the bear out of the den, because we need body weights in the winter and maybe change the radio collar and whatever. So our routine that we developed over the years was if you were down in a den like this and you needed to get out, either quickly or whatever reason, you clicked your heels together. And And so people had to have hold of your ankles in case you needed to get it. But notice that these guys are not actually holding Wayne's ankles. They're holding the bottom of his rain pants. So Wayne, I have some background here. I had my 3 young female graduate students with us that day. And they're standing kind of over here. And out of the picture. Anyway, so Wayne says he needs out. These guys pull mightily like this, but they don't actually have hold of Wayne's ankles. What they have hold of is his rain pants and his jeans. So everything gets pulled down. Wayne says, "Oh, Bert." He comes out, stands up to give these guys shit, and he's facing my 3 impressionable who saw more of Wayne that day than they'd ever wanted. Anyway, that's not normally how we do it, but you can see that the nature of the den. This is, again, one of these ones down in a crevice where, you know, about 80% of the dens were. So pretty amazing. I always thought the bears were down there. And this is one from the Georgian Bay side. It's a pretty dark picture. This is Doug, our pilot, up in there. Here's the bed, a huge bed that the bear had made. And this is way up in that talus slope on the Georgian Bay side, under a huge boulder. And one of these ones, again, that we had trouble localizing. Anyway, amazing. And yeah, you get pretty dirty doing some of this stuff. And here's our crew, again, doing some winter work. I'm not sure what we were doing here, but getting measurements. And everybody likes to get pictures of bears. There's Ron Williams. I don't know if Ron's here tonight or not. Getting some measurements on the bear. Getting some weights. 98.6 pounds is pretty light. Male, female. Also, one thing I learned about, so you know, black bears often have a bad reputation, and people have lots of people have negative views of black bears. And one thing I found over, you know, I've been doing this for almost 30 years, that if you can get somebody out in the winter and a den that's got female with cubs, and you say, "No, would you mind hanging on to that cub and keeping it warm?" You got it. The whole attitude changes about bears. They've got this cute little bear cub, and they forget about the size. It's going to ultimately be 500 pounds and break into their bird feeder. Anyway, so that's Melissa, and here's a little guy. So we tried to time our den visits to when the cubs were about 8 weeks old. So if they're born in typically across Ontario, we think there's roughly 100,000 bears in the province, or maybe 10,000 females are having cubs. So every first week of January, across the whole of Ontario, there's maybe 25,000 cubs born. And they're born naked and blind. Well, not blind, but their eyes are closed, their ears are closed. They don't have much hair. And so we try to time our visits that we would get there when the cubs are about 8 weeks old. But their eyes open at about 6 weeks, and their ears start to open up, and they also get a fair bit of hair development. And you can see this little guy, his eyes are not quite open, but he's getting a fair length of hair. And that's good, because they can control their own body temperature a bit once you take them out of the den. But as I said, nobody ever... Somehow we're in our blue phase here. But yeah. Everybody's always keen to hang on to cubs. So this is, again, the Bruce den down in the limestone. And what's going on here is we've got an adult female here, and this is her yearling who's up against her. So we've handled everybody, we've given them the reversal, we put them back in the den, and got a picture. And that's, I think that's the ear tag on the little guy. Okay, so we estimated abundance on the entire, so we had done the small area, just the park, back in 2001, and then the park had 2 or 3 times over those years had estimated abundance of bears within the park itself. But in 2012, we worked with the First Nations people and also with Parks Canada and our local Laminark people. We sampled the whole entire Bruce Peninsula north of Martyn. And in May and June of 2012, and we detected 71, so that unique individuals, and that gave us an estimate of a little over 300 for the whole Bruce Peninsula, with this confidence interval of, you know, the actual actual estimate somewhere between 225 and 400. And our estimate that 97 of those occupied the park. Remember that earlier estimate from the park was a fair bit lower, but we had higher capture success. We had in 2012 we had higher capture success. Anyway, so that's how we did it in 2012, and we also assumed that part of our modeling that density was going to increase as you went up farther north. So we had actually stratified in terms of our modeling 3 different ways. But you can see where we had all the traps laid. And as, I mean, I've retired now, I'm not involved, but our M&R people in Parks Canada and Saugeen Ojibwe First Nation are resampling that whole area again as we speak. The last grad student we had working on this was a young woman named Agnes Pelche, and she was also a geneticist. She looked at black bears across all of the province and found that they were in 3 large genetic clusters, 3 very, very large ones, kind of northwestern Ontario, west of Lake Nipigon, and then east of Lake Nipigon, all the way down, and then the Bruce Peninsula being distinct, which confirmed Karen Mills's work with farmer samples. And so mitochondrial DNA is passed on in the female line, right? And what Agnes found was that there were actually, these 36 haplotypes. So if you do any of your stuff with Ancestry DNA or National Geographic, if you're interested in your own DNA, what you'll get is your haplotype information back. So she found these 36 haplotypes. So that's 36 essentially gene types found in females. They were found out across all of Ontario, but there were only 2 on the Bruce Peninsula. Now, much reduced, not unique because they were found elsewhere in Ontario, but because there were only 2, and the rest of the province we were going to find large numbers of these haplotypes, that suggested possibly a bottleneck somewhere in the past. And so, in a subsequent paper, Agnes looked at this, a paper which is published last year. So we looked at various scenarios to explain this really low genetic diversity of bears on the Bruce, especially in terms of mitochondrial DNA. And so the conclusion was, at least in a genetic sense, that there were conservation concerns for Bruce Peninsula black bears, because our results suggested this recent demographic bottleneck reduced migration onto the Bruce, again, all that development around the southern end of Georgian Bay. And suggestion that if this isolation continued, Bruce Peninsula bears could lose up to 80% of these rare alleles within 100 years, which is a serious, from geneticists tell us anyway, a serious issue. Right, so when I was working with Agnes and Chris Kyle, who's a co-supervisor, we're trying to approach this, and we've got this suggestion of a bottleneck, and I was reading the work that Fungal Ryder Sussman, a botanist from University of Waterloo, had done. Now, what he documented, though, is that the frequency of forest fires on the Bruce increased dramatically following settlement in the 1870s. Sometimes there were fires that were set to clear the land. Sometimes, there were stumps that were gathered all together and lit on fire, and then the fire would get away. And there were 2 very, very large forest fires. One in 1902 that covered much of the northern part of the peninsula, and one several years later that covered much of the middle of the peninsula. So we speculated that those 2 very large forest fires would have led to much direct and indirect mortality of bears. And so, go ahead. Sorry, I'm really having trouble figuring this out. All right, I'll leave that thought. One of her conclusions. Thanks, I'm getting help from the booth back there. Thank you. Sorry, I try not to override what you're doing. I think you should have that point by now. So Agnes's work demonstrated from all the genetic analysis that, yeah, there was really good evidence that there had been this extreme bottleneck sometime, and our hypothesis was that it was these very large forest fires. And so, you back up. All right. Anyway, I'm losing my train of thought here. So, anyway, so PowerPoint giving us trouble. Try one more. All right, let it go. All right, so one of Agnes's conclusions was that there was this real risk of a loss of genetic diversity within the next 100 years. And what she suggested was that one way that that genetic diversity could be enhanced or at least maintained would be by periodic introductions of bears onto the Bruce Peninsula. All right, so why don't we move on to my conclusions. I seem to have lost a whole whack of slides here. I had a whole pile of slides to show you the dense stuff, and I don't know what happened to the PowerPoints. All right, so that was the main conclusion from Agnes's paper. All right, so what are the general conclusions for all these 4 grad students that I had and all the years of work that we did? So from Melissa's work, these dense mixed and dense deciduous forest beds are really, really important habitat features, especially outside of the national park. So maintaining integrity of forest stands is really vital to survival of this population, ultimately. This is really unique. 80% of these dens are in these rock crevices. Pretty cool. Bruce bears are genetically distinct. So we've had bears occasionally found places near like Stratford or Strathroy, and I think within the last couple of years even all the way down the Lake Huron shore as far as Sarnia. And when we've been able to get, if they've been roadkills or whatever, we've been able to get samples from them and run the DNA. What the way the forensics people have to word it is that we could not exclude the Bruce Peninsula as a source for that bear. And of course that ties back to the fact that there are only these 2 haplotypes on the Bruce, but those 2 haplotypes are found elsewhere. So if you found a bear with one of these haplotypes, it could well have come from the Bruce, but it might also have come from over near Sudbury or well, not Sudbury, but somewhere over to the east. Because the haplotypes were not unique on the Bruce. But if we found a bear that didn't have, say down near Sarnia, that didn't have one of those 2 haplotypes, then it must have come from somewhere else. So that's one thing that the people now are trying to follow up on. If we can get some samples from bears down that Lake Huron shore and document it, yeah, it looks like a pretty good chance they're coming from the Bruce, then that's important information for what's going on with the status of bears. And this low genetic diversity, so a small number of haplotypes, but also a reduced number of alleles in terms of the microsatellite DNA and reduced proportion of alleles, is best explained by this bottleneck in the early 1900s, combined with the fact that for a long, long time, because of all this development around the south end of Georgian Bay, there's probably been low or almost no immigration onto the Bruce of other bears from elsewhere. So, that most recent abundance estimate from 2012 was there's roughly 300 bears north of Highway 21, about 100 in the Bruce Peninsula and those interspersed lands. Conserving habitat outside of the park will have the greatest effect on population persistence. But it's also important to lower overall mortality, especially incidental, non-natural mortality. So bears that are killed in conflict with people. If there are ways that we can reduce that, that's going to be really good for the population. And I guess one last thing, I would say that this project that we had started in a very low level in 1998, ran all the way through the winter of 2006. I thought was a really good example of collaboration between a federal agency and a provincial agency. We had small budgets. Frank and I both had quite small budgets that we can contribute, but we had lots of goodwill. lots of people putting time into the project. And I think one more picture. So this picture was sent to me when notice first went out that we were going to do this presentation. It was supposed to be back in April. Remember the storm? A fellow named Gord Stewart. Is he in the audience? Igor sent me this photo that he from his trail camera from his property, which was the 16th of October of 2017. He got a female and a couple of cubs. And I can't remember exactly. I think you said you thought you had seen maybe 7 or 8 different bears that fall, something like that on your property, which is sorry.
Around 8, yes.
Right. And 3 of them here, obviously. And your property's not too far from Tobermory, I guess.
3 kilometers out of town.
Right. So anyway, bears around. Anyway, I apologize for the missing slides in the middle. I don't know what happened to all the pictures we had in Dennis, but anyway, that's what I have for you, and I can try to entertain questions. Guessing you probably. So the question is, are they, whoever, M&R, presumably bringing in bears from elsewhere to try to increase the genetic diversity? Without consulting with the public, that would be pretty unwise, I would think. They want to, if they ever ask me for my advice, I would say, well, based on my 33 years with the ministry, you might want to consult with the public before you do that. I'm guessing that there would be people who would be in favor of that. There would also be people who say, you know, it's crazy. We've already got human-bear conflict. Why do we need more bears? So it's not happening yet. Certainly, Agnes, who is my PhD student, who's pretty strongly recommending it. And you know, our advice and our comment in the paper was that obviously there'd have to be extensive consultation before such a would happen. But certainly, geneticists argue the way it ought to be done. Yes, ma'am.
What's the ambient temperature inside the den in January when these infants arrive?
Right, so the question is what's the ambient temperature inside the den? I don't know exactly what the ambient temperature is, but it's certainly above what's on the outside. Bears are pretty well insulated. You know, they have really dense underfur and dense guard hair, and they also have at least early in the winter, they have a very thick fat layer. And so they're pretty insulated. And so they maintain body temperature, but also that tends to warm that cavity, because of course they're breathing, so there's warm air, exhale, what have you. What I found interesting on the Bruce compared to other places where I've worked in the province is that these bears that were down in these rock crevices were often getting dripped on. By the time we went into the dens in third week of February, you're already getting spring melt happening here, and so you've got water that's percolating down right through the limestone. And yeah, but it's warm-ish in there. But the cubs are so the females that have cubs are wide awake because they're nursing those cubs, and they're also grooming them, and like dogs, you know, they like them to induce them to urinate and defecate and then to eat that and whatever. So they keep the cubs well like this. And classic position when you go into a den with a female that has cubs is she'll be kind of like this. Instead of lying on her side, she'll be kind of like that, and the cubs will be under her, so she's protecting them that way. Yes, sir.
This is about a question about habits, bears' habits.
Right.
And we have a property just back here, and it's a large property, 70 acres or so. I know we have bear dens on the property because when Frank was up here, we had Frank come out, and he actually went down into a couple of crevasses like you showed, and he said, well, there's no bear in there now, but it definitely is a bear den. So my question is this: over the years, we've had mother bears with cubs come onto the property, and usually in the late fall, but we haven't seen them in the last few years. But we always see bears, but the bears just seem to be a little bit bigger. And I'm wondering, are these the same bears that came with Mum 2 or 3 years ago, and they know that they can come on the property and they're not going to be messed with? because we have one coming back this year, for example. We're watching this guy, and he's been back like about 5 times over the last 2 weeks. He just seems to know where he's going. It's like this is home for him, and he's not the least bit concerned that we're there. He just comes in, and if he sees us, he gives us a look, and we give him a look, and he carries on. So is this a habitual thing? Is likely one of these cubs that came when he was little, and then came back when they were a yearling, and now he's bigger?
Right, so I'll recap the question quickly. So the question is really the bear behavior.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so do young bears come back to the areas that their mothers occupied? So typically what happens in bear society is that the young males disperse. So cubs are born in January, they stay with their mom, all that. So cubs that were born this January will stay with be out of the dens now, they'll stay with their mom right till this fall, they'll den with her again. And then in May of 2019, the family will break up. And typically, the young males then disperse. They leave where they were born. But the young females stay home. So if you look at detail at the structure, it's a matriarchal structure. If you look at the genetics of all those neighboring females, you'll find that they are sisters, or they're half-sisters, or mothers and daughters, or what have you, right, of the females. On the Bruce, I think because it's so constrained, I think that there's less evidence of male dysmorphia. You know, we were not able to study this because we didn't have a large enough sample size. But I'm guessing that because of the way the Bruce is, that males probably don't disperse as far as they do elsewhere in North America, for example. And so who knows whether that's a male or a female that's coming back, but certainly a female would come back to that area where her mom was. And maybe her mom has now died, or what happens is that the female, the mom, will kind of shift over, move her home range if she can, and so the younger females kind of squeeze in between the 2 older gals, and then eventually one of the older gals dies, and then the young female can expand her home range and whatever. So yeah, chances are, especially if she's so used to you, the chances are pretty good that she's an offspring that was born there.
He's definitely not afraid of us.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
You said that it's difficult to pick up the radio signals when they're down in dens and crevices and that. How did you determine which crevices to go down to look for these bears? Like hitting this or?
Right. So typically before snowfall in the fall, people would walk in and try to localize the den entrance. So we would have a pretty good idea. And it actually was less of a problem from these crevices. Where it was really a problem was on the Georgian Bayside, and on all that the big cliffs and the talus slopes and whatever, all those great huge boulders that are in there. And the radio signal would bounce around all over the place. And I actually remember one day we had a helicopter, because we had a helicopter over to land on the ice, and we were trying to climb up in, and we could not localize this. And I said, that signal keeps pointing to the top. So I think Melissa hopped in the helicopter with the pilot, and they went up to the top of the escarpment, and she was trying to locate. We thought maybe the bear was right at the top. We never did ever find that bear. We were all over the place. Crevices was typically less of a problem. You could generally localize in the fall. The bears, down this crevice. If you sneak in quietly in the fall, once they're in the dens, if you sneak in quietly, you can get in without disturbing them, and you get a pretty strong signal coming into that den.
Is the bears hunt still taking place in Ontario? I thought it was. And
Question is the bear hunt still? Yes.
Okay, and so is there a case to be made that since the Bruce population is genetically distinct, that for the Bruce Peninsula it should be suspended?
So the question is, could a case be made to suspend the bear hunt on the Bruce Peninsula? Well, you'd have to look at all the available information, and one of the really critical things is how many bears are there on the Bruce, and what is the trend in the number of bears. If the trend in number of bears is not decreasing, then that would be a weaker argument. But that's not for I'm out of the one with legislative authority. But there's actually a group forming now that will have Parks Canada, MNR, and First Nations people who will be working towards a bear conservation strategy for the Bruce over the next couple of years. And I'm sure that's, if any of you people are involved in that, I'm sure that'll be one issue that certainly something that ought to be looked at. Right. Yeah.
One of your slides, you described the crevice dens as unique.
Right.
What did you mean by that?
So the comment was that in one of my slides I described these crevice dens as being unique. And what did I mean by that? Well, I don't know. I don't even know of any, there's no place else in Canada I know of that bears a den in this kind of karst topography. And I've never seen anybody, any published papers of it elsewhere. In fact, Melissa and I got to get our act together and get that paper published. But, so it's just the fact that they're going down these really narrow crevices. It's a straight vertical drop right down, and I can hardly get down there. So bears are built differently from us, right? They've also built like dogs, so they're even though they're fat in the fall, they can, because they're built differently, can still squeeze down there. And then the fact that you would get down there, and then there would be this chamber that, for all the world, looked like somebody had carved it out of the line. We have a rounded ceiling and whatever, but obviously it was glacial meltwater that had been circulating around in there and actually melted inside. So I guess those aspects, and then the fact that the bears quite often, when we went in February anyway, quite often the fur was wet because they're getting dripped on this water percolating down through and they were getting dripped on. So those kinds of things, certainly different from anything I'd ever seen.
One piece of maybe positive news is that the Biosphere Association is working on a forest connectivity strategy, and we may be able to announce some good news at the end of June in terms of funding for that. We have developed the strategy, and now we've gone for implementation funding, so we're hoping to, because we know that for large ranging mammals such as bears, forest connectivity is very important.
What's the life expectancy naturally of a bear?
Did you see the Rick Mercer show I was on? He asked me that question. What's the life expectancy of a bear? I said, somewhere in the 20s. What's the life expectancy of a bear research? But anyway. I should actually have put that video clip in. You might have enjoyed that. But anyway, if many of you probably have seen it, but if you haven't, Google Rick Mercer and bears. Rick's crew came out with us in 2009, Philadelphia. So it gives you a really neat feel for bears in different habitat. In a non-hunted population, they'll live well into their 20s.
Oh, okay.
We've had bears that were into their early 30s.
Oh.
It gets pretty hard. The growth lines on the teeth get very, very close together because the older they get. And so once they get past 10, 12, 15, it gets more and more difficult to get an accurate assessment. You have to get 2 or 3 people to read it and kind of reach agreement about, it's 27, 20, whatever. But yeah, well, and the oldest known bear in the wild was a female that the Minnesota people, Dave Garcelis and Karen Noyce, had followed for many, many years in their study in Minnesota. And she was, I think when she died, she was 34.
Oh, okay.
That's obviously the upper end. Yes?
I was just wondering, with the genetic isolation, and perhaps you had mentioned earlier on, inbreeding possibly, is there an effect on the behavior of the bears, or the health of the bears, or the lifespan of the bears because of this genetic isolation?
So the question is, because of potential inbreeding, are there any effects on behavior or health, body size, things like that? We couldn't detect any differences in things like body size or number of cubs they were having or what have you. I don't know. Geneticists sometimes get a bit alarmist about this low heterozygosity business. There are lots of examples of populations out there with pretty low heterozygosity, and it doesn't seem like it's having an effect, but ultimately it might well. We didn't see bears with 6 toes or any of these kinds of things. But certainly, it's a potential concern. Yes. And there are other organisms where it has been a real problem. Cheetahs, for example. So it's a real issue with cheetahs.
I had a bear biologist explain to me that after the beginning of August, they pretty much eat apples. And is it that simple, or was he being glib?
It's not that simple. It's not that simple, depending on where you are. In the boreal forest, there quite often there's blueberries until early September, certainly into August. And if it's a mountain ash crop, then they'll be feeding on mountain ash and hazel in late August or whatever. I don't know what habitat that bear biologist was referring to. Maybe around here, maybe. But there's lots of meat in those mixed deciduous stands. Lots of I don't know. Jody, have you heard is there much evidence of beech bark disease?
Yes.
Yeah, there is. So that's I've been gone a decade. It's pretty hard to stay in touch, but that's a potential problem for black bears across central Ontario. That it's now even detected in sort of northeast parts of Algonquin Park. So it's going to sweep through. I had a grad student who worked on beech bark disease, and when he modeled, we made the assumption that what was keeping so that it's a kind of a two-stage thing, right? There's the my head around this here. There's the scale insect, which is motile early on, right, and windblown, and then with its proboscis, hundreds of thousands of these things land on a tree. They're tiny. With their proboscis, they probe through the bark and they feed, right? And then they become sessile. They lose their legs and they become planted in place. And then so they don't actually carry the fungus, but it's windblown. But they've made all these holes in the bark, and so the fungus then gets blown along, and then it can penetrate the bark. So anyway, what we hypothesized in his work was that when we looked at the distribution of beech bark disease, where the fungus actually was, it looked like it was kept south by the -20 degrees C isotherm in January. And so we speculated with climate change, or what he modeled was how quickly that -20 would move north with climate change, and he predicted that beech bark disease would sweep through all of central Ontario within 40 years. It looks like he's probably right. Now, whether that was the cause of keeping it south or not, I don't know. Somebody's got Rick Mercer here. You want to see him?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry, you have a question first. Just hang on.
Welcome to Algonquin Park in beautiful northern Ontario. This is the place that inspired the group of 7. They love to come here and paint its rugged beauty, when of course they weren't running away from the over 2,000 black bears that make this park home. How do we know how many bears there are? Well, every winter, someone has to track down the bears as they're hibernating in their cave, and then crawl inside the cave and then tag the mother bear and their babies. And this week, that person is me. Note to self, must update will. So now what kind of wildlife can we see out here?
Okay, we've got 35 packs of wolves, we've got over 3,000 moose in the park.
So that's a moose carcass?
Yeah, that's a moose carcass. You can see there's all kinds of wolf tracks around it.
Oh, there's a wolf! Call for any moment! There's a moose. Oh, there's a cat. There's a moose and a cat. Oh, they're hiding in their tree. Very clever moose. And I've had a spectacular helicopter ride into the heart of Algonquin Park. And look who it is, Dr. Martyn Obbard. Hello, Martyn. How are you?
All right, nice to
Good
meet
to see
you.
you, sir. You are the bear expert.
I'm the bear guy.
You're the bear dude. What's the life expectancy of a black bear?
They'll live into their 20s.
And what's the life expectancy of a bear expert?
We hope a few more years yet.
What are we going to do out here today?
Well, this time of year, Rick, we're visiting our radio collared bears in their dens.
And they're asleep in their dens?
They're asleep, except for the females that have cubs. They're awake, because of course they're nursing those cubs.
Is that where we're going today?
That's where we're going to.
So this bear is awake?
She's awake.
Do you have a gun?
But we don't carry firearms.
So we're just out here in the woods, me and you. And you have students too.
I have students.
They're coming behind us.
They're coming behind.
So if push comes to shove.
Students are expendable.
Right. They're trying to come out of the den.
Sometimes, Rick, but...
And what do you use to protect yourself there?
That snow shovel that you've got.
The snow shovel. Do you think that's a good idea? An aluminum snow shovel from Canadian Tire?
You're going to block the entrance.
Block the entrance
You
with
are.
a snow
You're
shovel.
Put the snow shovel in the entrance so she can't get out. You're going to hold it. They're not aggressive. Put it that way.
I thought you said earlier that some of them weren't.
Some of them are.
I see. So they're not aggressive except for the aggressive ones.
Exactly. You have a shovel. Here, just up ahead here.
You've been saying that all day.
She's right here, Rick. She's just come around here a little bit. You can see her ear tags and her radio, the top of her radio collar.
Get the drugs. Get the drugs. Did you see its eyes?
So we'll get somebody to make up the drugs.
How about a double dose?
Sometimes they need a double
I
dose.
think we should go with a double dose.
Okay, we'll see how the first one goes.
No, let's just double it up. What's this called?
Jabstick.
The jab stick. This is a real technical operation, isn't it? Shovel and the jab stick. Oh, my shovel is ready.
In case she tries to come out.
I hit you and run.
There we go. Okay, time.
This is one of those moments that if something goes wrong, everyone will say they had a con. Go in there and get those cops.
Right. In a few months, they're quite young cubs. Their eyes are not open yet. So they're only about 6 weeks old.
I think there's 3.
You're right, there's 3.
You know how I can tell?
How's that? You could count.
Count the heads.
Just to see whether she responds.
Pull on the beer's ear.
Yeah, right. I think you're good.
Okay.
Okay, number 1. Good job.
How cute is that? Okay, little bear.
And another one.
Oh my goodness. Is that the cutest thing ever? Hello, little bear.
What we should do, Rick,
Okay, that's what we
is,
do now.
I think you should pass the cups over to
No. Okay, no. Can I name them?
well,
You don't encourage that, do
we
you?
number them, Rick.
I'm
so-
going to name them. The screaming one is Danny Williams.
Yeah, their batteries last about a year.
Okay, thank you. So just screw the things off?
Yeah.
And we have to send that to Ottawa because Stephen Harper needs it for Jim Flaherty. This is not an addition.
1, 2, 3.
Oh. Now we have to weigh this guy.
Just put him inside the
Put
bag.
him down in the Loblaws bag. What's he weigh?
So he weighs 1.5 kilograms.
Okay, shush, 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 shush. We're going to measure your head. Are Canadian bears the only ones with universal health care? Oh. That's it. Here's your new collar. Same as last year's model, except it carries way more songs. 2 baby bears. Oh, this one's breastfeeding. See why a magician's work with rabbits. Okay. Okay. That's a big 145.
1, 2, 3. Okay. Yep. And tuck the cups under against her chest.
And put her right up against her teeth.
Yeah. And then you can put all 3 right in there.
Okay. Do I have to put 3 back? 1? Just under my jacket on the helicopter?
Just her left front leg and put them on her chest.
Come on, there you go.
Number 2.
There we go. Come on, Daddy. Oopsie daisies. In you go. Okay. To number 3. Okay. Alrighty. Bye-bye, bears. Bye-bye, bears. Okay. Time to get out of here before Mom wakes up.
Now we're gonna close off entrance with branches.
Okay. Thank you, Marty, sir.
Rick,
That was an incredible day.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
We came, we saw, we protected a species.
You're watching the first report on CBC.
Thanks for finding that. I hope you enjoyed that. That was the most fun I had doing any kind of media stuff in my 32 years. Really interesting guy and a national treasure. Anyway, real down-to-earth Newfoundlander, bright. All those cracks that he makes are totally off the cuff. When we first met him, we had gone in my snow machine to where we were going to meet him because he was flying with the park biologists that were looking for moose and wolves first before he came to meet us. And landed, and we're all introduced. And the producer, the producer for the day, handed Rick a sheet of paper, and I saw there might have been 6 or 8 kind of single-spaced type lines on it. He had a quick look at it, crumpled up, and put it in his pocket, and I never saw what was in it. It might have been suggestions about things he could ask me or whatever, but all those jokes are, the thing about Stephen Harper, the caller for Flaherty, naming the noisy cub Danny Williams. Remember Danny's reputation at the time. Anyway, it was good fun. So you saw a little bit of what it's like to go into the dance picture. So anyway, before that, there was a question at the back.
Oh, thank you. I live about 5 minutes walk from here, and we have, I guess, dense mixed forest behind our lots, and we're right in the town. And we regularly get bears walking down our lot line, regularly, and occasionally, bear with cubs. And I would say almost daily, at different times of the year. Now there are plans to build a parking lot behind us, and we're kind of afraid of what the effect, because we love our wildlife, we get lots of wildlife, and we love our bears. They don't bother us, we don't bother them. They're not a nuisance bears. And we're worried about the effect of the parking lot going in behind us on what has obviously been probably a trail that the bears have used for more years than we've lived there.
Right. So, you may have heard, since the comment came back, you may have heard it. So the question is, in behind this lady's lot there, mixed woods is going to be cleared and the parking lot put in. What would be the effect for the bears? If it's an area if there's a really well-worn trail that they use all the time, they will continue to cross through there, at least for short term. So there'll be a short-term effect for sure when the bears will keep using that area. And so there may be a risk of increased conflict. But bears are not stupid, and ultimately, unless they're using that area to get across to another area where they can feed. So they're going from A to B and they're feeding there. If that's the situation, they'll keep going. But if they just happen to be wandering through when that's no longer good bear habitat, they'll eventually stop going through there. But there may be short-term issues. I don't know. I mean, without seeing it, I couldn't say any more. But certainly a potential for some short-term issues. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, all the dens you visited were mum and cubs. What do all the adult males do? Do they den as well on their own?
Yeah, so we didn't actually have any collared males in this study, but other studies I have had collared males, and all black bears den in the winter because denning and hibernation is a response to an ecological problem, which is the absence of food. So there's no food, so bears den up. And for example, in southern areas like Florida, Georgia, whatever, bears may only den up for 2 or 3 weeks because there would be an absence of food for a short period of time. But here, it's going to be months. And the boreal forest bears could be in a den for 7 months. So it's a response to absence of food. So yes, males do den, but males quite often build a surface nest. So they'll chop balsam or spruce branches, and they'll chop them up and make a big kind of donut of a bed, and then they'll just curl up in there, quite often under maybe the low-lying branches of a white spruce or something. If there's some low-lying branches, they'll make a bed under there, and then and so then for much of the winter, they're actually covered in snow. And I've had females in that same situation and go in on them, and they've actually had cubs in that. So I've been standing, if it was really deep snow, you're standing in your snowshoes looking down a meter, and there's a female down in the bottom of this, and all of a sudden these little heads poke up. And so bears are tough animals. But yeah, males den for sure. A big male is not likely to go down into those crevices. They're pretty small, I would think, for a big male, but they'd likely build either these surface nests or an actual excavated den where there's enough soil to let you dig an excavated den. Yes, sir?
Smell like
Well, it's an interesting question because it smells kind of doggy. So bears, I don't know if you know this, but once they go into the den, they don't eat, they don't drink, they don't urinate, they don't defecate until they come out of the den. The physiology of hibernating bears is really fascinating. In fact, NASA put money into research studies done by physiologists in the States for years because what the physiologists figured out was that bears in the den didn't lose muscle tone and they didn't lose bone density. And critical things, you know, if you go on a 2-year journey to Mars and you step out of the spaceship and both your femurs snap, then that's a bit of an issue. So NASA was pretty interested in how do bears do this. Anyway, I'm digressing. But so if you didn't urinate for, get rid of urea for like about 3 days, it'd kill you. And it's from the buildup of ammonia. In fact, lots of us as we get really old, we die of kidney failure. And so it's the buildup of ammonia that's toxic. So animals like bears, physiologically, they break that ammonia down to amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. They break it all the way down to amino acids, and then they immediately rebuild it up into protein that they use for repair in the body during the den. So they don't have a buildup of toxic urea, so there's no need to urinate to get rid of that urea. And for water, they don't drink, but if you metabolize fat, which they build up all the stored fat under the skin during the summer and fall, if you metabolize fat completely, you break it down to water and carbon dioxide. So they obviously breathe out the carbon dioxide and they use the water internally if they need it, right? So so it smells really nice in there. Unless you've got a bear that's unless you've got a bear that's in really, really poor shape and physiologically is now starting, it's no longer able to metabolize fat because it's used all of its fat. It's actually now starting to break down protein. And then that bear will have so much buildup of protein byproducts, ammonia, that it'll actually urinate in the den or urinate at the entrance to the den, and then that does smell. But that's rare. Most of them doesn't. Yes?
So when some of those bears are under the trees and they get buried deep under snow, what do they do for oxygen? Do they use a lot less in that hibernation state?
Right, so the question is bears that are very deep in the snow, what do they do for oxygen? They use a lot less, and yes they do. Because their metabolic rate, now their body temperature only drops a few degrees, so it goes from 38 C down to 33, 34, so it's not a profound drop, but it's enough of a drop. But their metabolic rate does drop, and they're relatively inactive, so they haven't got high energy demands. And so yes, they are using less oxygen, but also snow is pretty porous, so air can move. But also, the other thing that happens if they really are completely buried in snow is that warm air rising will actually melt out kind of an area. So when we would go into a den, if it was one that we hadn't marked in the fall, or we weren't exactly sure where the entrance was, one of the things you would just look for would be a breathing hole like that. And because the bear does move around in the den, there would be dust kicked up, and the dust would get carried up in that warm air. And then, of course, as soon as that warm air hit the cold snow, then the dust would precipitate out, and so you'd get this, you know, kind of dirty entrance, and so you'd know that that was the entrance of the den. Yeah. So, yeah.
Martin, you've done a lot of studies with polar bears.
Right.
What's the, when they're denning with their young, how long do they den for compared to, say, a black bear?
That's the question is about polar bears. How long do they den for? So the only polar bears that den in the winter are pregnant females. All the rest of the bears go out on the ice to kill seals, right? And in fact, if polar bears could stay out on the ice year round, they would. But in areas like Hudson Bay, they get forced ashore every year because the ice melts. Our pregnant females went into the dens typically in November, the polar bears, and so they give birth, or sometimes October. So they give birth usually probably in December. And then when the cubs are 2 to 3 months old, they come out of the den and they hike back to the ice. So those female polar bears, probably their last meal, but by the time they get back to the ice, their last meal was probably 8 months previously. So they might have killed a seal in July, say, and then the ice melts and they're forced ashore, so then they haven't had a meal since, they're stored fat, obviously, but they haven't had an actual seal meal since July, and now by the time they get back on the ice, it's March. And some of those bears are hiking, 100 kilometers back to the sea ice because they dead from it. Yes.
Marty, is there evidence of the documented dens in the Bruce being used over and over, the crevice dens?
We didn't document that because we didn't have enough bears in the study and it didn't go on long enough, but that's the general pattern that bears will reuse. What we found in a boreal forest study, because we had a very large study there, we sometimes had 60 or 70 bears on the air, and we followed individual females for up to a decade. And what we found was that they seemed to have maybe 3 or 4 dens within their home range, and they kind of cycle around. And typically they wouldn't use the same den in consecutive years. Some bears did. In fact, we had one female, it was a really aggressive female, and I said to Rick, most bears are not aggressive, but occasionally they were. And I don't know, something about the meat, I will soon. Anyway, never mind, that was a bad joke. So we had this one female who was really aggressive, and so I tried about 4 years in a row to drug her in the den. I could not get her. She would use the same den year after year, and the entrance went down and then back like this, and then at the end there was a kind of like L shape, and she had her bed here, and she would lie there like this, and she'd peek around the side of the thing with one eye, I slowly said, she'd just wait till I got close or she'd come flying out of the entrance. Anyway, I finally figured out, I think about this thing. God damn it, I'm going to get her next year. I think about it and think about it and think about it and plan. So it was 1 year, I went in and I think, I think I tied a mitt to the end of a stick or something. And I had my drugs on the other hand, and I riddle in there and I put the mitt there when she came flying out of what was really cool was she did not use that den ever again. Next year, she left. But she won 4 times, I won once. So typically they would not use a den, and I've often wondered why. The argument often given for birds not using the same nest is that it's ectoparasites and all this kind of stuff. But bears, they just don't have much in the way of ectoparasites. They might have a few loose ticks on them, but not much. So I don't know why they don't. Sometimes the roof of the den will collapse, and so it's not particularly good the next year. But anyway.
This is a practical question. As I said earlier, we have this bear. He's coming back like 2 or 3 times in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And he's a big bear. I don't know if he's a male or female. Never got that close. But
I'll tell you how to tell the difference.
My question is this.
There's an easy way, sorry.
There's been, we've seen him through the window. We've seen him when we were on our patio. One day I was on the top of the boat. And we're in safe situations where the bear's not going to bother us. He's not the least bit nervous about us being there. It's just a matter of time, I think, that I'm going to come around the trailer, and he's going to be there. What do? Because, this is his forest. I'm just living there.
Right.
but I just need to know what do I do.
Can they even play a snow shovel?
I was using one about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
The sign was in the park.
There you go.
They use paintball.
Yeah, so you probably heard the questions. So this is risk of a surprise encounter. And in a surprise encounter, bears can be unpredictable.
Right.
You know, he could swat at you in a surprise encounter because he's startled, you're startled, he's not sure what
We
you
try and
are.
make a lot of noise whenever we go
Well,
out.
that's a really good idea.
That's the only thing we
Yeah,
can do. I guess.
absolutely.
But if you're coming around the corner and he's like right there,
Right.
what do you do?
Do you have a Foxborough whistle you carry on your life preserver or empty?
No, I never usually carry a whistle.
Get one. You know, they're $5. And if you are thinking you're going to be coming around the corner, blow it a couple of times.
When I have seen him, like I've clapped my hands and went like this,
Right.
and he just looks at me as if I'm not. What's with you, buddy? He's not worried at all.
Well, it's cool for me to hear that it doesn't particularly bother you. I mean, you're a little concerned about it, obviously, but you're not rattled by it.
No, I'm
And
not.
that's-
Yeah.
So that's pretty neat, and I wish that, you know, we could all be like that.
I'm just being careful. I just.
Yeah, yeah, well, sure. And you're enjoying having him around. So.
Oh, we love him. He's great.
But, you know, if there are these situations where you're worried that you might start, especially say around dusk or maybe after dark or whatever, then, you know, get your Foxborough whistle and blow it a couple times, and he'll know that you're coming.
So how do you tell a black bear is male or not?
Right, so for males, what you want to get a good look is when they're broadside to you, so they're walking like this.
Mm-hmm.
Because the penis on a male is fairly far forward, and their long hairs hang off the end of the penis.
Okay.
So if he's like this, the penis will be ahead of the thigh, and you'll see the long hairs hanging down. It's really obvious. In a female, the vulva is obviously back between the back legs. And so if she's walking like that, you won't see any hairs in front of the thigh. So you need to get a look at her directly from behind. And if you can get a good look in good light, you'll see long hairs hanging down from the vulva. And they're quite often urine stained. And so they're kind of matted.
Thank you.
Okay.
Once you know, you can tell your grandkids, you can
They want to know.
as long as you have a good relationship with your friends.
Martyn, I just like to editorialize a little bit. We have to remember, this is their living room. We're guests.
So the comment that we need, I guess, as a society or whatever, remember this is the bears. They were here first. And,
Yeah.
well,
We
yeah.
live here. We're visitors.
I'm with you. But it's tough. You know, we have a growing human society. We have loss of habitat everywhere, and you know, it's just going to get worse over the next 100 years, that's for sure. But, yeah. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
On the Bruce, is there enough habitat for them to move as they would like from South Bruce to the north, or are they ending up with sort of subfactors within Bruce through the little pockets?
Right, so the question is, on the Bruce, is there enough habitat that they could move fairly readily south and north? Yeah, we have pretty good evidence from our radiotelemetry that bears are moving. I can't remember now from the genetics results how much, we had some bears moving a fair distance, but I don't remember about that far. Of course, that's, you know, when we're sampling genetically, it's within a pretty short period, like 6 weeks. But we did have bears move a fair distance. So some males, and you know, bears are pretty cagey. If it's an area where there's a fair bit of human development, whatever, they'll become nocturnal, and so they'll move at night. And so especially, and then traffic is less and all these kinds of things. So bears are really pretty cagey and pretty risk averse. There's a really neat paper just published by a grad student from Minnesota within the last several months. He had heart rate monitors implanted in bears, were to the vet and so on. And what they were interested in was, were bears risk averse when they approached roadways? Because they were concerned about road mortality and whatever. And what they found was that bears' heart rates spiked as they approached a road. And then they would cross, whatever. But so bears were aware that this was a potential risk to them, based on the sort of heart rate monitors and whatever. But they were also able to figure it out. So some of them, went at lower traffic volume times, some of them crossed at night and these kind of things. So they're pretty aware of the risks in general of what's out there in the environment. Now, lots of bears get killed on roads too. Yes. Yes.
Are there any known effects on the bears from these studies that are done while they're denning?
The question is, are there any known effects of going into the dens and handling the bears? I've had several people write really nasty letters to me, like, why are you going into the bears and whatever. There's no, I mean, people have been going to black bear dens since the 70s, and nobody's ever documented any issues. And one of the things that we were asked a lot was, okay, you drug mom, you give her anesthetics and whatever, and she's nursing. Do you drug? No, we don't drug the cubs because they're too small. They're little cub. If you overdose it, you kill it, right? So, and you don't need to. There's no reason to. They're not aggressive or anything. Sharp claws, but that's it. And these drugs, the drugs that we use are metabolized pretty quickly, and so the suggestion is that there doesn't seem to be anything passed through from mom through the milk to the cubs because it's metabolized pretty quickly and excreted via the kidneys. Not as far as we know. Occasionally, people have handling mortalities. Very occasionally, just like humans on the operating table, right? People die on the operating table all the time, have an allergic reaction to the drugs. Occasionally, a bear, something like that happens. Right. And I've done CPR on bears and brought them back, and I had to do CPR on a bear for once. I could not bring her back. So it occasionally happens.
So if that were to happen with a mother with cubs, then the cubs would be brought to another sanctuary.
We got time for another story? So,
give another commercial.
In the early 90s, we had a big study in Chapel, so we would run 3 crews. And not my crew, but one of the other crews actually had an adult female have an allergic reaction to the drugs, and she died. And they did CPR on her, they couldn't bring her back. And we don't have paddles, or you're just doing compressions. And so she had 2 cubs. So now what to do? And fortunately, it was a year when a lot of the females were having cubs, so they were synchronized. And I said, well, I remember talking to a guy from Pennsylvania that you can go and you can give these cubs to somebody else. So this was, other than being there when my own kids were born, this was the most spiritual thing I've ever done in my life. So we had these 2 now orphaned cubs, and we had a female who we knew she'd had 2 or 3 litters, and we knew that she was a really good mom. She was a big female, but we knew that she produced lots of milk and whatever. And so I visited her the day before, and she had 2 cubs of her own. Actually, sorry, the female who died had 3. So we had 3 cubs we had to take care of. So I went back to this first female, to the 2 of her own, and opened up the den again. I knelt down, and she kind of looked at me, and I took the cub on my hand and I put it out like this. So she was lying in the classic nursing position. They're on their back, kind of on their rump like this, and the cubs are on here. So her own 2 cubs were nursing. And she just kind of looked, she was in an excavated den, she just kind of looked at me. I knelt down and I handed, as far as I could reach the cub. And she turned and she bared her teeth and she went like this. I thought, oh my God, she's going to nail it. But she picked it up by the scruff of the neck and she moved it and she put it on her chest. Just like a dog would do, right? With just picking up with the incisors. And then I held the second cub and she did the same thing. And so, and then we closed up the den. I thought, well, now she's got 4, right? 2 of her own and 2 adoptees. So one of the adoptees did die that summer, but she raised the other one and her own 2. And then we took the 3rd one to another female. So so that raises a really interesting question. I'm glad you asked it. Why did she accept it? So, if you tried that in June, if you tried to give an orphan cub to another female, she would chase it away or she would actually kill it. She would recognize that it's not her own. But there's no evolutionary reason for a female black bear to be able to distinguish her cub from anybody else's cub while she's in the den. because they would never encounter anybody else's cubs while they're in the den, right? So it seems like this ability to discriminate your cubs from other cubs, presumably based on scent, perhaps on voice size, I don't know, or combination, doesn't really kick in until after you leave the den. So, pretty cool. And they really are the best cubs. Okay, this sounds like we maybe should wrap it up. All right.
By how much interest there is in the presentation and all the questions asked. So just thank you so much.
You're welcome. Right, thank you.
Get in without the. No, I don't think that.
No.